Hello, today I'm going to present my philosophy of evolutionary biology project, and the subject is an improved demarcation criteria. So, as some context of what my project actually focuses on, my argument regards the demarcation problem, and specifically what that is the challenge philosophically to define the specific criteria that's used to differentiate or separate science from non-science. And so its primary focus isn't whether a theory is true, but whether it's structured in a way that allows it to be tested to be true or potentially not true and disproven. So that's the demarcation problem. Okay, and one of the answers to the demarcation problem that I also use in my argument is Popper's falsificationism. And this is just a very popular idea that posits that the scientific theory must have a risk of falsifiability in order to be considered as science. So this is one of the answers to the demarcation problem. And an example of this is Einstein's general relativity, right? That theory predicts that starlight bends to gravity, but if the 1919 solar eclipse had shown otherwise, the theory would have been proven to be false right at that instant. And so the risk of being wrong uh, is kind of this central idea of what makes something scientific, and that's Popper's falsificationism. And what I'm saying in arguing and doing my philosophical work is specifically on saying that this standard of demarcation, Popper's falsificationism, I'm saying that is flawed. And why it's flawed is natural selection. So I'm using natural selection as an example of why falsifiability itself isn't enough, right? So specifically, the tautology problem is very commonly criticism of natural selection, right? This they posit that the definition of natural selection is the fittest organisms survive and reproduce, and who are the fittest? Those that survive and reproduce. So there's this circular reasoning, and what the idea is basically this can't be falsified, right? If you use Popper's falsificationism, it's hard to differentiate natural selection clearly into science or non-science. And that's why I'm saying it is flawed and the criterion should be improved. Um, Okay, and specifically, I'm saying that what actually improves this criterion is this second criterion, and which I posit is called the non-teleological causation. And Thomas Coffin argues and brings this topic up in his paper about natural selection. And what I'm kind of doing is adding it to Popper's falsificationism in order to complete the criterion. And so, what this actually means is basically that processes and scientific theories shouldn't be caused by and shouldn't be forward looking or purpose based or goal oriented, but rather should be mechanistic. And what that means is just being caused by its parts and the inherent like parts that create the process themselves. So it's causal, it's not goal oriented. And so natural selection is an example of this, right? Natural selection has variation that arises randomly, selection pressures that are not forward looking, and finally, no agent that guides the process. And so I kind of took this idea of what Calkins was arguing for natural selection and broadened it in order to improve demarcation criteria as a whole. Okay, so far I've only given you pieces of my argument, and now it will all come together through my toy argument, right? So Popper, which I've already said, holds that theory is scientific only if it can be, in principle, be falsified, right? And I'm saying that this alone does not reliably solve the demarcation problem. And why? Well, natural selection is an example, in which I explained earlier. And thus, I propose that a scientific theory must satisfy the non teleological condition as a primary criteria that is more important than the falsifiability, right? I'm saying that it should explain phenomena, theories, these scientific theories should explain phenomena through efficient mechanistic causes, which just means the opposite of goal oriented or predetermined ends, right? And I use the example of natural selection again. Natural selection satisfies this condition, and because it does, even despite there to be controversy and criticism about failing falsifiability, because it satisfies this, it is very much supposed to be a scientific theory. So what I'm saying is, not that falsifiability shouldn't be a criterion, right? I still think that it does do, philosophical work. If a scientific theory can be falsifiable, it is a good reason to believe that it is science and not pseudoscience. But I think that, as I say right here, falsifiability should remain as a secondary, less important criterion under the non teleological condition, which should be the primary condition, right? Mechanistic theory also can usually resist straightforward falsification. There's a correlation, in which I argue that if a theory is non teleological, it usually does resist straightforward falsification as well, right? So, thus, neither criterion fully succeeds independently, but together, I argue that they provide a more philosophically stable account of scientific demarcation. Okay, and here's my argument, which kind of is repetitive of the things I said. So my main claim is we ought to adopt a two-part framework for demarcating science from non-science, and I define that framework right here, right? So it's this improved framework that involves both A, mechanistic cause, which is the non-teleological condition, and B, falsifiability. Um, and I'm saying that A is more important than B, but both should still remain criterion, and it isn't necessary for both, right? So reason one, and so these are the reasons for adopting, right? Reason one, falsifiability alone is insufficient. Reason two, non-teleological condition must be added, and the examples I use for one are natural selection tautology, and then the examples I use for non-teleological conditions is basically the paper with Thomas Coffness that explains how natural selection um, suits this, but also can be expanded to all processes in science and biology itself. All right, and now to go over some objections. So the two main objections are is number one is non-teleological condition excludes too much of biology, because biology uses lots of goal-oriented language. And number two is survival of the fittest implies evolution aims toward fitness. Therefore, natural selection itself is teleological. And I'll go through. Okay, so to basically respond to the first objection, which argues that the non teleological criterion is too severe, I respond that this objection fails because it conflates two fundamentally different sense of purpose, right? So we can take the example of the immune system, and one may argue that this is a process, like many others, goal oriented, and the purpose of this is for pathogen elimination. And I argue that this is not actually um, forward looking causation, right? We're just using this term because of things that happened in the past, right? We know that immune system helps health and prevent diseases, but that's actually not what my criterion actually means. My criterion doesn't regard about what patterns occurred in the past, but rather what actually explains this theory, right? This let's just take the immune system itself. I argue that it is not teleological because it's actually just a series of mutations, series of genetic code that codes for proteins in different cells, and all of these mechanistic parts are what causes the theory to become what it is. And so I argue that this objection fails because it conflates the concepts of teleological purpose wrongly. Okay, to respond to my second objection, which is natural selection itself is purpose driven, this is important because if this is true, if this objection is true, my entire argument fails because I use natural selection in the first place to argue that the popular criterion of falsification alone isn't sufficient, right? So if I am wrong about this, then my entire argument fails. Um, the way I respond to this is that this view is fundamentally mistaken because natural selection has no aims, only outcomes, right? So this is similar to the last objection, but different in that it considers my natural selection itself, which is considered tautological, right? Um, and I'm saying that the fittest do not survive in order to achieve a goal, but rather survive simply because they possess traits that clear a current environmental filter, right? So this is more of an actual reality instead of a retrospective summary of previous effects. And so natural selection isn't teleological. And here is my bibliography. Thank you for your time, and I hope this was an insightful presentation.